All right, let's jump right into today's explainer. We're unpacking a complex and, let's face it, often highly stigmatized world, commercial sex. Today, we're going to bypass the moral debates completely. Instead, we're looking at this strictly through the lens of rigorous empirical data, historical facts, and neutral public health analysis. This is a massive global industry, and to truly grasp how it functions today, we absolutely have to look at the evidence. To get a handle on all of this, here's our roadmap. We're going to cover definitions and distinctions, a global historical timeline, social and economic drivers, compare global legal models, look at public health and human rights, and finally, future trends. Let's get into it.
Section 1. Definitions and distinctions.
Okay, so the absolute crucial starting point here is understanding the shift in terminology. The term sex work, that was really popularized in the late 20th century to reframe things as an economic activity. It's about labor dynamics, occupational safety, you name it. It essentially moves us away from the older, highly moralistic and pathologizing language tied to the word prostitution, and instead puts the focus squarely on worker agency.
Now, we have to make an absolutely vital distinction here. Voluntary adult sex work is not human trafficking. International law, like the UN Palermo Protocol, makes this super clear. The core differentiator, it's consent. Consensual sex work means adults making an agreement with mutual bodily autonomy. Trafficking, on the other hand, fundamentally relies on force, fraud, or coercion for exploitation. They are structurally completely different things.
When you actually map out the taxonomy of the industry, it's pretty wild how broad erotic labor really is. We're talking everything from direct physical contact and escort services, all the way to non-contact stuff like webcam modeling or pornography. And those non-contact ones are often regulated under totally different media and free speech laws. But again, the scale completely tips away from consent the second we move into that red zone of human trafficking and abuse.
Moving on to Section 2, a global historical timeline.
Historically speaking, the norms around this have shifted dramatically. Back in classical Athens, the state actually ran municipal brothels, and high-class educated courtesans, called heterae, had major cultural sway. Then, fast forward to medieval Europe, and you see this policy of regulated tolerance. Municipal governments and even church officials were licensing brothels, like the famous stews in London. But then, hitting the 19th and 20th centuries, we see this massive pendulum swing toward moral reform and strict criminalization. And all of that eventually sets the stage for the decentralized digital gig economy we're living in today.
It's fascinating to see how state power and cultural shifts constantly redefined what's legal and what's visible. Take the British Empire during the colonial period, for example. They enacted the Contagious Diseases Acts, which forced highly racialized, medicalized regulations on women, literally including forced lock hospitals, all just to protect military troops. Contrast that completely with the post-war HIV/AIDS era. That's when public health organizations radically reframed sex work as a human rights issue. They realized, hey, punitive policies are actually just making the virus spread faster.
Section 3. Social and economic drivers.
Academics use a bunch of wildly different frameworks to make sense of all this. Functionalists, well, they view it as serving a latent social outlet. Marxist theorists, they frame it strictly around class and capitalist exploitation. Feminist perspectives are deeply divided. Liberal feminists tend to emphasize a woman's agency, pushing for decriminalization as a basic rights issue. Radical or abolitionist feminists, however, see all prostitution as inherently exploitative, basically a form of systemic violence. And then you have rational choice theory, which just strips away the ideology entirely. It views the whole thing simply as micro-sociological market exchanges where people are just weighing costs and benefits.
When we look at what actually pushes people into the trade, economic deprivation is pretty much always the #1 factor. But it's super intersectional. We see social exclusion based on caste, like the elite women in South Asia, for instance, and systemic gender inequality constantly driving marginalized groups into this work. On top of that, LGBTQ+ individuals, especially transgender people who face intense housing and employment discrimination, often turn to sex work simply because it's one of their only viable survival options.
From an economic standpoint, we're talking about a massively lucrative global market. It's driven by huge macroeconomic forces, high income inequality, labor migration, and global tourism that fuels multi-billion-dollar sex tourism economies in places like Thailand. And today, technology has practically obliterated the traditional barriers to entry. The digital gig economy, coupled with cryptocurrency, has blown the market wide open. It allows workers to keep way more of their income while entirely bypassing highly restrictive banking systems.
Section 4. Global legal models compared. Depending on their specific cultural and ideological values, countries handle this in wildly different ways.
You've got everything from the strict criminalization of absolutely everyone involved, which is common in a lot of the world, to partial criminalization. Then you have rigorous licensing and legalization systems in places like Germany and the Netherlands, where workers are actually paying taxes and operating out of licensed storefronts. And finally, you have full decriminalization. For policymakers today, the big debate usually comes down to the Nordic model versus full decriminalization. Sweden pioneered the Nordic model back in 1999. The idea there is to eradicate the trade by criminalizing the buyer, not the seller. Proponents argue it starves the demand. But if you look at peer-reviewed surveys of sex workers in those exact regions, they report feeling pushed into the shadows, facing even more marginalization and housing insecurity. Now contrast that with New Zealand. They fully decriminalized the industry in 2003, stripping away criminal penalties and just applying standard occupational labor laws. The result? Government and public health reports show workers felt significantly safer, and they were way more willing to actually report violence or abuse to the police.
Which brings us to Section 5, Public Health and Human Rights.
Okay, this is a really sobering statistic. According to UNAIDS data, globally, sex workers face an HIV infection risk that is 9 times higher than the general population. 9 times. That single number alone tells you exactly why public health officials treat the legal status of sex work as a literal life or death issue.
And the physical danger is just as real. Studies show that anywhere from 45 to 75% of street-based sex workers experience physical or sexual violence on the job. But here's the deeply systemic problem. That danger is actively made worse by punitive laws. When sex work is a crime, victims can't exactly go to the police to safely report a robbery or an assault, right? Because doing so means they'd likely get arrested themselves. So, it effectively forces the entire industry underground into isolated spaces where predators can just act with total impunity.
This empirical data is precisely why major international bodies, we're talking the World Health Organization, UNAIDS, Amnesty International, all strongly advocate for full decriminalization. And they aren't coming at this from some moral high ground. They're looking at it from a strict harm reduction perspective. They've synthesized the global data and concluded that, hands down, recognizing sex workers' labor rights is the absolute most effective way to reduce violence and curb epidemics.
Finally, Section 6, Future Trends.
We're currently witnessing a massive explosion of virtual erotic labor, algorithmic platform economies, and borderless crypto payments that easily bypass traditional state controls. The physical street corners of the 20th century, they've practically been replaced by the digital devices sitting in our pockets. Which leaves us with a pretty vital question to chew on. As technology continues to outpace our traditional legal frameworks, how on earth will our laws evolve to ensure safety, prevent exploitation, and uphold human dignity in this entirely new era of commercial sex?